Hello and welcome to the League of Women Voters of Oklahoma this evening. I'm happy that you could join us. What you'll be hearing tonight is an overview of the Citizens Initiative Petition process, and additionally, a review of pending legislation that could impact it in ways that may make it more difficult to use in the future. My name is Doris Kupfer, and I'm the co-chair of the League of Women Voters of Norman. Before I introduce our speakers this evening, I'd like to say a couple words about the League of Women Voters. So we are in our 101st year of existence, and we remain a nonpartisan political organization that does not support either political parties or candidates. And we encourage informed and active participation in government at all levels and urge influencing public policy through advocacy and education. So that's what we're doing this evening, is educating ourselves a little bit about the process and hearing about legislation in case there's some advocacy that we would like to begin with. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers. First is Melanie Rughani. She is a director of the firm Crow and Dunlevy in Oklahoma City. And we are really lucky to have her speaking to us tonight, as she is one of a handful of attorneys in our state who has substantial experience with initiative and referendum petitions. She's represented both proponents and challengers at all stages of this complex petition process. And she's the one who will give us the overview of the existing process this evening. And second is Andy Moore, and he's the executive director of 3 Oklahoma-based nonprofits: Freedom of Information Oklahoma, Let's Fix This, and People Not Politicians, which all play a role related to government transparency, civic engagement, and democracy reform. He is also an entrepreneur in residence at the OU Price College of Business and serves on the boards of Generation Citizen of Oklahoma and Rank the Vote Oklahoma. And he will speak to the pending legislation coming in this term from our legislature and give us an idea of its impact on the existing procedures. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our two speakers. They have some slides for us today. And at the end of their presentation, we'll have a Q&A and be able to ask them some questions. Okay. Andy and Melanie, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Doris, for that kind introduction, and thanks for inviting me to speak with you all tonight. I love talking about initiative petitions. I've been doing initiative petitions for about a decade when I moved here from Virginia, and completely lucked into it working with Kent Myers, who's done a ton of initiative petitions, more than anyone in the state. When I went to law school in Virginia, I'd never heard of initiative petitions because Virginia doesn't have any sort of direct democracy system like Oklahoma. And so when I got to Oklahoma, it was really neat to see how we have so many state questions, which drive so much citizen involvement and engagement. So we'll start with the basics of initiative petitions and why we have them. I asked my son, who I'm homeschooling this year during the pandemic, where the quote, government of the people, by the people, and for the people comes from. And he said the Constitution. And I decided we're going to have to do a little more homeschool, but it's from the Gettysburg Address. There is no initiative petition process or any sort of direct democracy process in the US Constitution. It's entirely state-based. And so every state has a little bit different process, different rules, different goals for the process. In Oklahoma, we have three types of direct democracy. We have the initiative petition, which is the type that most people are most familiar with. It's when individual citizens, any citizen who wants to, can propose either a constitutional amendment or a statute, which is then, if they are able to get enough signatures, can be placed on the general election ballot for a popular vote. And there is no requirement that the legislature sign off on it, approve it. It's entirely citizen driven and citizen determined. We also have a referendum process where if the legislature does something that the people don't really like, they can prevent that law from taking effect unless and until it's approved by a popular vote. It's a similar process to the initiative petition. There's a few differences, which we can talk about later, but it's another way that citizens can advocate against laws that the legislature may have done that the citizens don't like. And then finally, there's the recall process. There's no statewide recall process, but certain cities in their city charters have provided the ability to remove government officials from office by popular vote. So where is direct democracy? I mentioned that I went to law school in Virginia where there's no direct democracy. If you look at these states, they are largely the Western states who were drawing up their constitutions in the late 1800s and early 1900s, in the time of William Jennings Bryan, his Cross of Gold speech, the rise of the People's Party, the Populist Party. It was a time when there were the robber baron era, where banks and railroads and political machines had a lot of power and in a lot of places had captured state legislatures. And so farmers started banding together against what they saw as the corrupt practices of the state legislature and the national financial sector. And they founded the People's Party. And that People's Party populism movement was advocating for issues like women's suffrage, free silver, the labor movement. And in the process of advocating for those things, they began advocating for direct democracy measures. So that's why you have the majority of the states with initiative process in the Western states where they were drawing up their constitutions at that time. So every state, again, we don't have a national direct democracy or national initiative petition right. So it's entirely a state creation. So every state has different rules for initiative petitions. There's different signature requirements. There's different circulation periods. Some states require that you get a certain number of signatures in a certain area of the state. Different court procedures. Some states provide protection for laws that are passed by citizen initiative. They say the legislature can't repeal it for a certain number of years, or they need a supermajority to repeal it, things like that. Every state's different. And if you look at this chart, you'll see Oklahoma's down here in red. We have one of the most difficult initiative petition processes I think, in the country. We have, to get a constitutional measure passed, we need 15% of the votes that were cast for governor in the last gubernatorial election. That's the highest percentage in the country, except we're tied with Arizona. And if you look at Arizona's other requirements, Arizona has a circulation period where they can collect those 15% signatures in 2 years. Oklahoma has 90 days. That is basically the shortest circulation period in the country. So we have the highest signature requirement and the lowest circulation period. We also have no protection for citizen-initiated laws. The legislature can repeal a citizen-initiated statute the next day, which is why we have so many constitutional amendments. And so our 15% threshold is a pretty high threshold, and to get that in 90 days, we'll talk about later, is difficult. So the purpose of initiative petitions, there's quite a few of them. We talked about how it had found its roots in the People's Party, the populist movement, and they were trying to circumvent problems that they saw with the representative democracy. industry capture. They were worried about the banks and the railroads and big industry, robber barons having too much power. And so direct democracy was a check on those entities, those special interests in the legislature. It also helps circumvent gerrymandering. Andy will talk a lot about gerrymandering, I'm sure, later. But if you have legislators that are not accountable to the citizens, this is another way that citizens can put a check on that legislature. And it also prevents gridlock. You know, there's a lot of areas, as we've had a rise of party politics that have kind of separated and become a little bit tribalistic. This allows people to build coalitions over issues that have broad bipartisan support, but for whatever reason, they're opposed by the political party that's in power. For example, criminal justice reform, so State Question 780 and 781, and then 805 were areas that we were able to build coalitions from both Republicans and Democrats on issues that may not have gotten through the legislature, which is dominated by one party. Same thing with Medicaid expansion. You're able to build coalitions among different parties and still get things done when the party politics may not otherwise allow that to happen. It also allows education and engagement of citizens on key policy issues. People can build movements behind criminal justice reform, Medicaid expansion, issues like that. It drives public participation in a way that's just not as possible with state legislature and legislative politics. And finally, it allows people to provide an external check on legislators. So an example is a few years ago, there was an initiative petition put forward to raise the gross production tax to 7%. If you remember back to a few years ago, what was happening was we were trying to find a way to fund education. Some people had proposed using the gross production tax to do that. It was then set at 3%. And people put forward an initiative petition saying, all right, legislature, if you can't get this done, we're going to get it done and we're going to raise it to 7%. And the existence of that initiative petition, I think, put a lot of pressure on the legislature to say, okay, fine, we don't want a 7% gross production tax, we're going to implement a 5% gross production tax. And so you can use initiative petitions to push the legislature as well. So our initiative petition, our right of initiative, is set forth in our state constitution. Article 5, Section 1 says the people reserve to themselves the power to propose laws and amendments to the Constitution, independent of the legislature. And Article 5, Section 2 says it's the first power reserved by the people. And Article 5, Section 2 sets forth the percents that are necessary, 15% for constitutional amendments, 8 for statutory, 5 for a referendum. And then Title 34 sets out the specific procedures and processes that we'll talk about later. Andy put this information together. It's telling us how many initiative petitions have been proposed since statehood, 419, and how many have been actually made it to the ballot, 88. That's not a great percentage, 21%. And of those, 25 passed, so 28% of those. Which is kind of shocking if you think about it, particularly if you've lived in Oklahoma the last decade or so. It feels like we vote on a state question, multiple state questions every year. And I think there's a misconception out there that those are all initiative petitions, when the vast majority of state questions that we actually vote on come from the legislature. There's a legislative referendum that the legislature can agree on a joint House Senate resolution to put something on the ballot for people to vote on, to approve or reject. And so that's the majority of our state questions. We've only had 88 that have made it to the ballot, but they've been big issues. So we voted on, most recently, Medicaid expansion, criminal justice reform, medical marijuana, things like banning cockfighting, liquor by the drink, state question, that requires a supermajority for revenue bills, term limits. We created the Ethics Commission and the Judicial Nominating Commission by initiative petition, all sorts of kind of major public policy issues. As for the nuts and bolts of how we do initiative petitions, this is the chart that we give to potential clients who are looking into whether they want to do initiative petitions, and it terrifies them because it is a unwieldy process, to say the least. You start by, before anything gets filed, hashing out the policy that you are trying to put forward. That's where you build a coalition, you get input from different stakeholders, determine who's going to be involved, what your policy is going to look like. You also have to decide whether it's going to be a constitutional amendment or a statutory amendment. And that's a pretty important decision because it determines both how many signatures you need to gather and how much protection it's going to get from the legislature. Then you have to form a legal entity, usually a 501c4, but there's different ways to do it, and fundraise. The initiative petition process in Oklahoma is absurdly expensive. I say that as someone who charges money to help proponents do initiative petitions, but the legal process is a tiny fraction of the money that ultimately gets spent on initiative petitions, primarily because, as we talked about earlier, we have a very high signature threshold and a very short time period within which to gather those signatures, 90 days. And so in order to get you need about conservatively 200,000, preferably 300,000 signatures in 90 days, it's hard to do that in a pure volunteer effort. So you end up having to hire signature gatherers, and that gets real expensive real fast. So we kind of ballpark it. An initiative petition, most initiative petitions cost somewhere between $1 and $4 million to get to the ballot, which is an unbelievable sum. Then you draft the petition, hopefully involve a lawyer or someone with experience in drafting statutes or constitutional amendments and complying with all the rules in Title 34. Then you hire your circulators and your consultants and your media people, and you have to be ready to start circulating your petition pretty much when you file it. Because once you file your initiative petition with the Secretary of State, the Secretary of State publishes notice that you filed it, and that triggers a 10 business day protest period where anyone in the state can raise a legal challenge to your initiative petition. If you don't get a legal challenge, the Secretary of State sets your signature circulation deadline 15 days later, and you're off to the races. You have to be ready to start circulating day one on that process. So you have to have your circulation infrastructure ready to go when you file. That said, it is quite likely that you will never actually use that infrastructure for quite a while, because if you do draw a legal protest, that is an original action in the Supreme Court. And so there's briefing, there's an oral argument. The Supreme Court has to decide the question, and that can take anywhere from 3 months to a year. You never know. So in that time, it's very unpredictable when you're going to end up actually circulating signatures. But once the protest period is resolved, again, you have a 90-day period to get your required signatures. We suggest getting a pretty decent buffer. 25% is ideal, because there's always a chance that someone, their address that they give on the petition doesn't match their voter ID, or various things that go wrong with signatures. And rather than have to have a narrow margin and have to litigate each one of those signatures, it's much better to just have a large buffer so that you don't have to have a legal challenge that goes signature by signature by signature trying to qualify. After you have gathered, and so you need a certain number of signatures. Right now, based on the last gubernatorial election, 15% for a constitutional amendment you need 178,000 signatures. So we suggest, somewhere like 300,000 signatures. For a statutory initiative, you need just under 100,000. That's a lot of signatures to gather in 90 days, but people have done it. Once you've completed gathering your signatures, you turn them in to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State does a facial count. They're supposed to weed out the obviously bad signatures, signatures from Mickey Mouse, or signatures from Kansas, or the very obviously wrong signatures. And then they count them up and they generate a number. And if that number is larger than the threshold, there's a second protest period where, again, anyone can bring a challenge to the signatures that you've submitted. At that same time, anyone can bring a challenge to the ballot title, which is that little paragraph on your ballot when you end up actually voting yes or no. The proponents propose one, and then the Attorney General usually rewrites it. And so in that second protest period, there can be litigation over what that paragraph should look like to make sure it's fairly written, everyone can understand it, things like that. And then finally, if you survive 2 protest periods and a 90-day signature gathering period, the governor issues a proclamation setting your measure for election. It automatically goes on the next general election ballot unless the governor sets a different date for it. You saw the governor set Medicaid expansion for the June ballot rather than waiting till the November election. He can pick any date that he wants. And then finally, you have the campaign where people advocate for the measure in the media, in groups, meetings like this, and try to convince people that this is a good policy, and the vote. And you need a simple majority to approve currently. The referendum process is very similar. The only major difference is, regardless of whether you file and you get a legal protest, all signed petitions have to be filed 90 days after the close of the legislative session in which the bill that you want to keep from going into effect have to be filed 90 days after that. And if a referendum petition is filed with facially valid signatures, the law that is at issue in that referendum petition doesn't take effect until it's approved by a vote of the people. So it's a way to prevent a law from ever actually taking effect. And it cannot be used on any law that is passed with an emergency, which is why a lot of bills that you wouldn't think actually are an emergency end up getting passed with an emergency clause in order to prevent the referendum process. Recall, as I mentioned, there's no statewide recall process. It's governed by various different city charters. And we've seen kind of a rise in recalls lately of city council members and mayors, but that's a topic for another time. Andy's going to talk about bills that the legislature has put forward this year to make initiative petitions harder. I think there's some good reforms that we could do to make the process better. The biggest one being to extend the circulation period. One of the main arguments used by the legislature to say we need to have some of the bills that they're trying to put forward is that the initiative petition process excludes rural voters. That's sort of by necessity, because if you've got 90 days to gather 300,000 signatures, feasibly, the best place to do that is in your population centers where people are. And so because of our short circulation period, these initiative petitions tend to be focused in the population centers, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, Norman. If we extend that circulation period, you cut down the need to focus in those areas. We could also protect initiative petitions from the legislature. Right now, the reason why everyone seems to be doing constitutional amendments is that just because the legislature can repeal a statute the next day. And so you're going to put in a ton of time and energy and money that could just be repealed the next day. If we provided some protection like other states do, either giving the legislature, you can't repeal it within 5 years, or you need a supermajority to repeal it, that would encourage more people, I think, to not amend the Constitution and instead do statutory measures. And finally, allows some sort of neutral pre-clearance process for the gist, which I didn't talk about, is the paragraph on top of your signature page that gets circulated that's supposed to summarize what your initiative petition does. And that ends up being the basis for a lot of legal challenges because it's an easy legal challenge. You can always argue that the one paragraph someone wrote to describe a 20-page initiative petition is not sufficient. And that ends up being a basis for a legal challenge, which is expensive and time consuming and really gums up the process, and it's costless. If we could just get some sort of neutral pre-clearance process before filing, that could eliminate that basis of gamesmanship. And with that, should we take questions or save those for the end? I will turn it over to Andy.
Sounds good. Melanie, that was tremendous. Thank you very much. As a reminder, if you're watching at home on Facebook, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we will get them and respond after my first section here. And so I'm going to hop into PowerPoint and that should still work. All right, so we're gonna run through the proposed changes. I think Melanie left it off at just the right point to to hand it off to me. So there were a bunch of bills this year. We'll start with last year though, just to paint the picture. So last year, two changes. How major they are is up for debate. But they were changes to the signature collection form. So the form you actually sign when you were signing a petition. And that new form, to my knowledge, I've not seen it. Historically, it's been the same one for a long time. This bill instructed the Secretary of State to make a new form. I think it might make it easier in some ways to actually fill it out. However, I think the intent behind it was to make it easier for opponents of a particular ballot initiative to challenge the signatures, because the end result is that the forms will be scanned in and they have to be verified against the voter file, the registered voters. So that's part of it. The other bill that went through last year requires campaigns to begin making financial disclosures beginning the date that they filed their initiative, as opposed to what it is or what it has been, which was the date that you actually qualified for the ballot. Honestly, in a spirit of transparency, that's a good thing, I think. It's more cumbersome for campaigns, but it was also somewhat unnecessary because regardless of when the date is, you have to start disclosing, you have to go back to the beginning of the campaign. So let's say you file today and you don't qualify for the ballot for 8 months, you would still have to report back to today. That's the way it was. So everything gets reported either way. They just bumped up the date that you have to start reporting. So more money for the folks that help run compliance and make sure that you meet all those filing deadlines. And my hunch is this is like a somewhat underhanded way to expose people's donors so that you can call them out in the press, right? Like that's how politics works with this kind of thing. So anyway, those were last year. And then filed this year, I kind of categorized them and then we'll go through them individually. There were 26 measures altogether this year. Some required fiscal impact statements, like either in the ballot title or in the gist, or they had something to do with fiscal impact statements. One involves a filing fee at the time that you file. A couple deal with having longer protest periods or the period of time that Melanie mentioned where opponents could challenge what you're doing. And then a whole bunch that change the signature collection process or make changes to the percentage of votes required to pass at the ballot, and sometimes both. So just a quick note, if you are interested in reading more about these bills, like the actual text on Let's Fix This on our website, we added this legislation tracking piece. And so you can see in this little button up there. That's where you find it all. And then there's the link to it also down below. If you scroll down on the same page on our website, there's a video that's called How to Track Legislation. It's on our YouTube channel as well. And it basically walks you through how to use the legislature's website, which limits the number of bills you can track. I learned this year. And then also we use Legiscan, which is free. They have a paid version as well, and I encourage you to support them if you use it. eCapital's one, there's a bunch, but that's hopefully a helpful resource. All right, so we'll go through the order in which I mentioned them previously. Fiscal impact statements are the first one, House Bill 1767, which is currently assigned to the Senate Rules Committee, would increase the length of the 2 protest periods from 10 days and 20 days. That's not a fiscal impact. I have it in the wrong table. Anyway, there's that. House Joint Resolution 1038 would require before a petitioner or an organization or people file their initiative, you have to have it certified from the state auditor and an inspector or other designated state entity, which is ambiguous, and whether or not it would increase state expenditures. If so, then that measure would be required to pass with 60% majority of votes. And this is a good point to point out. As I go through these bills, note that any of them that are joint resolutions, like this one, HJR is House Joint Resolution, those would require a vote of the people. So some of these changes that they've proposed, they can make just through the legislature, but some of the other ones, the bigger ones, would actually have to come to a vote of the people. And I'll highlight some of the irony in that. Senate Bill 947 would require the ballot title, which is what actually goes on the ballot, that paragraph, that would have to include a fiscal impact statement and indicate the potential source of funding, including but not limited to federal funding, legislative appropriations, or whatever. So in your paragraph of how you summarize the bill, you would also have to suggest how it's going to be paid for, and if it's going to require a new tax or elimination of some kind of service. Now you can obviously see through this one, the intent here is to try to make them scary, so that it would dissuade voters from voting for it. I get that their argument is people, might be duped into voting for something that is going to cost the state money, like Medicaid expansion, I guess. And they want people to know what that figure is. However, that kind of information typically comes out by whoever is running the opposition campaign. And any good campaign that is running something is going to be transparent and disclose how this is going to work, what it's going to cost, all of those things. Also, it is somewhat, up in the air about who would decide these things, because it is technically the legislature's job to address the state budget. And so, if I'm the petitioner in this, how am I going to know if it's federal funding? Okay, if it's legislative appropriations, if it would require a new tax or an existing elimination, that is a decision that is ultimately up to the legislature. Okay, so filing fee. This would be a Senate Bill 1011, which is in the Senate Rules Committee, would require proponents to pay a $1,000 filing fee to the Secretary of State at the time you file. So we'll see how that goes. They haven't, as of today, they haven't said if it's on the agenda yet, but I know it's assigned to Senate Rules. And then changing the protest period, Senate Bill 506. That's the one that I mentioned earlier, that I would change the length of the 2 protest periods from 10 to 20 business days. Just gives folks more time to file a protest. 10 days is sufficient. They always file it on day 10 anyway. But this, basically gives the other side more time to do legal research to mount their opposition. All right, and then changes to signature collection. So these are the big ones, and these are a little nuanced, so let me kind of walk through it. So House Joint Resolution 1002 would change the number of signatures required to be a percentage of each county as opposed to just statewide. So Melanie discussed, for a constitutional amendment, it's 15% of the turnout in the previous gubernatorial election. Statutory is 8% of the turnout in the previous gubernatorial election. This bill would require it to be that 15% of each county, and that the total number you need is based not on turnout, but on the total number of registered voters in the state. And because we have fairly low turnout in our state, this would basically double the number of signatures that you would need. So you would still need 15%, but 15% of the total number of registered voters, not just the number who voted. So as she mentioned earlier, like our threshold is already very high. This would be, even higher in the raw number of signatures needed. House Joint Resolution 1039, similar deal, but instead of county, it would be based on each congressional district. And then these are not impossible to overcome, but by golly, they're really hard, right? If you were out there trying to collect signatures and you have to get 15% of registered voters in Alfalfa County, it's really hard to go out there and drive around and find folks and convince them to sign this petition. Senate Bill 917 would require background checks to be completed and on file with the Secretary of State. Now, this is different. There's some other states that have background checks that are required. They just, like Arkansas is one, and that gets a little dicey, but they generally say you have to run background checks and keep them. This one would require us to do background checks on all, on anybody. Some states it's based on just paid collectors, but this makes a volunteer signature collection almost impossible because you'd have to find all your volunteers, and before they can volunteer to collect signatures, you got to run a background check, and that can take time and cost more money. And so it really drives campaigns towards hiring big paid signature collection firms, which a lot of them use anyway. But if part of their argument is that they don't like people using paid firms, then why would you drive them to that be their only option? So not a good bill. SJR 7, 8, and 10, they would all change it so it's a percentage of voters in each congressional district, but it would just still be based on turnout in the previous gubernatorial election, not on the number of voters in each district. There's all those. And then changes to the number or the percentage of votes required to pass. House Joint Resolution 1004 would require that if an initiative petition is on the ballot, simple majority is not enough. You would have to get a 2/3 majority, 67%, in order for it to be considered passed. So that's a exceedingly high bar. House Joint Resolution 1007 and 1008 would both require a 55% majority to pass, but only a simple majority to repeal. So if you were repealing a measure that the legislature had passed, you only need 50% plus one. HJR 1034 and 1035 would require a 55% majority or a simple majority in at least 20 counties. And I haven't done the math yet, but now I'm curious of looking at what are the 20 least populous counties, right? And trying to target those. Because if that's the case, in theory, you could get by with way less than an actual majority of votes if you just got a simple majority in the 20 least populous counties. So this one might backfire. Maybe not a good policy there. HJR 1038, 60%, but only if the measure has a fiscal impact. We mentioned that one earlier. And then SJR 4 and 5 are just a 60% majority. And so we'll come back to that table that Melanie showed earlier because that it relates to these things. Then there's some shell bills, as there are on any given topic, that we keep an eye on. House bills 1208 through 1212, so 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Those all are just titled the Initiative and Referendum Policy Act of 2021, but they have no substantive language. And then House Joint Resolution 1042, 43, and 44. The language they have is just a very simple verbiage change where it changes 8% to 8% and 15% to 15%, nothing else. They're all identical. And so I will say all of this with a word of caution. As we know, this no bill is ever really dead during the legislative session until they sine die. And since this is the first session of the current legislature, most any bill that doesn't pass this year rolls over to next year. So of these we went through, only 2 of them are still alive. Only 2 of them made it out of committee and off of the House floor. So they went over to the Senate. They're both in the Senate Rules Committee, and they may or may not be heard over there. If they're heard, they may or not pass committee. If they are, then they go to the floor and they may or may not be heard or pass there, right? So there's still some steps in the way. We think that there's a non-zero chance that they'll get through, but we'll come back to that. So what's the rationale behind these changes? Why are folks proposing these? What, what are they thinking? As Melanie said, the initiative petition is the first right given to Oklahomans in the state constitution. There have been, especially recently, some very significant pieces of legislation that passed via the initiative petition: Medicaid expansion, medical marijuana, criminal justice reform. And even if you go back in history, there's a bunch of other bills that have passed that were pretty significant and that have had ongoing consequences for our state, right? So state question, is it 610? It passed in 1992 that requires the 3/4 majority of the legislature for any revenue raising measures. Basically, the reason we haven't had a tax increase in 30 years, well, we've had one in 30 years. That was an initiative petition that has stuck with us for a long time and had, I think, very real implications for our state budget. So the legislature is reluctant, if not hesitant or opposed to allowing the people to take democracy into our own hands and pass laws that we think we need. Good, bad, or ugly, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, or trying to govern as best we can. And if you look at these 3 things in particular, the most recent ones, Medicaid expansion, medical marijuana, and criminal justice reform, these are all things that are, definitely had majority support because they passed at the ballot. And if you just look out in, polling data, these are all broadly supported by the public. And they're all issues that the legislature really worked on for a while and couldn't get the football into the end zone, right? And so Medicaid expansion being one of those where they talked about it and they were super opposed and they were kind of into it. And then last session, they passed it, right? The governor said, we want to pass it. They passed it. Then he vetoed the funding bill at the last minute. And so, proponents got it out and did the deal. And so the intent behind the initiative petition is to allow the public to pass legislation in this way, and it's been successful. We've seen also, efforts on the part of the legislature to limit or restrict the executive branches and in some ways the judicial branches. Some bills of note this session, House Bill 2336 and 2337, that would restrict the authority of the governor in his executive orders, right? And that's in a response to COVID related stuff and somehow how things have gone over the last year. But this is on the heels of them giving him some more power, and now they're starting to reel it back in. And if you follow political news in Oklahoma, surely you've seen some of those kind of back and forths between the legislature and the executive branch. And then certainly House Bill 1236, it's gotten a lot of press this year, which is a bill that gives the authority to the state legislature. In their mind, they give themselves the authority to ask the Attorney General to challenge any federal executive action or law that they believe is unconstitutional. And if the AG doesn't agree with them or refuses to do it, then it would allow the legislature to deem the law or action unconstitutional, which is not how it works. That's just not how the law works. That in and of itself, I believe, is unconstitutional. So the irony of using an unconstitutional law to say that something else is unconstitutional is pretty funny. And also with irony, the measures that would change the percentage of votes required to pass. So like the most egregious being HJR 1004 there at the top. This, in order for this to pass, it's a joint resolution. It has to go to a vote of the people. So it takes a simple majority of people to approve a law that would require a 3/4 majority of people henceforth. So if we ever wanted to undo this, we would have to get 70 or 2/3 majority, right? And that's the irony of that is just boggles the mind. So as Melanie said, are these changes needed, or are changes needed? Yeah, there's some ways we could definitely change the initiative petition process to make it better. None of these bills are it, right? Like these all make it harder, more expensive, more cumbersome, if not outright impossible. So to bring up that chart again, and apologies to Melanie, I retyped it so it looks pretty on my screen. But the things that you highlighted are what I was going to highlight as well. And that's that of all of the initiative petitions that have ever been proposed in state history, and these are all listed on the Secretary of State's website, 419 have been proposed that were full-on initiative petitions. Only 88 made it to the ballot. And of those, only 25 passed. And if you look out at how many it would be that if the threshold was 60% or 67%, you get down to 16 and 6, right? So like to say, out of 419 ever in state history, only 6 have ever passed with 67%. And that's back in the good times when bipartisanship was alive and people of opposite parties kind of talked to one another and got along. In our very segmented, sorted life that we live now, and politics today, very few things pass with that kind of outstanding majority, unless it's in the state legislature or some other legislative body where one party has a mega majority, in which case that's how it goes. All right, questions. I'll stop sharing for a moment, and we can do questions. I see some here in the chat. Melanie, I'll read them and you can respond to the ones for you. Or Doris, you're back on. You can do it. You're the host. I'll let you do it.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, we've got several questions going. And Melanie, I think there was some enthusiasm for your presentation here. So awesome, very educational. You said that Oklahoma has the highest signature requirement, 15%. Maine only needs 3%. And that we also have the least amount of time to collect those signatures, 90 days, whereas Arizona has 2 years. Do you think this is directly related to the fact that Oklahoma constantly is at the top of the list for the lowest voter turnout? Why or why not?
That's a really interesting question that I hadn't thought about before, honestly. I don't think it's directly related because the 15% number is part of our original constitution. So that was back before we had any data on voter turnout, but it may be why it's stayed. It is certainly true that we have a much lower voter turnout. Interestingly, initiative petitions or House Senate resolutions are used to drive voter turnout sometimes. You'll sometimes see the legislature put a measure on the ballot, like an abortion measure or some English as a second, English only, those kind of bills that end up on our ballot. I think primarily to drive voter turnout for one party or the other. But I hadn't thought about it being related to that. That's an interesting thought. My gut would be no, just because it's not that big of a difference. You know, the 3 and 15% seems like a dramatically different shift compared to, I think we're just over 50% and maybe 70% for the higher turnout states. But it's an interesting thought. Thanks.
And Andy, a question for you. Do you know any legislators who favor your opinion as far as which bills are going to, in essence, make the initiative petition process impossible?
Sure. Yeah, there's a bunch, which is why many of these bills did not even get a hearing in committee, right? And so that's, I go through those bills. And I want to reiterate, only 2 of them are still alive that we know of, right? Others can always come back, but only 2 of them have passed out of committee or gone anywhere. The rest are dormant. And I think that speaks to the fact that, legislators know that Oklahomans care about our government and we care about doing the right thing. And in the instances where we have had to use the initiative petition process to get something through, it has almost always been something that the legislature couldn't do on their own for their own will or the political will in the building. It is not easy. It is expensive and arduous and frustrating. And so a lot of folks up there know it. Also, it's helpful, right? In some ways, allows us to get bills passed where the legislators don't have to vote on it themselves. And so I know this sounds like a little, House of Cardsy, but like sometimes there's things that legislators believe in, like medical marijuana, where they don't want to vote on it. And they're like, we just can't do it because they're afraid it'll end up on a flyer against them when they run for re-election. But by golly, once that medical marijuana was passed, they sure jumped on the bandwagon, right? Like, and we have the biggest program in the country. And they realized that they've got thousands of constituents who are card holders or business people. And so it's a whole different ballgame then.
Let's see, there's another question. Let's see, this is from Emily Dunsing. Who is actually writing these proposed measures? I cannot believe that the average Oklahoma legislator is really so concerned about the details of initiative petitions.
I'll chime in and then Melanie, if you have anything to add. So that's a complicated question, Emily. Some, like any bill, some are written by the legislators. Some are request bills from constituents or from organizations. We have seen across the country an attack on the initiative petition process. And so a lot of these challenges or changes are things we kind of expected. Like if you had just asked me to, cast some prognostications 2 years ago, I would have guessed it'd be these things, because we've seen it happen in other states where it tends to be one party more than the other, but trying to limit the people's ability to use direct democracy. And particularly this has happened in the last few years as groups like us, like People Not Politicians, and others around the country have pushed back on gerrymandering as being like one of the big issues. Well, with that, it's not so much a policy issue as it is directly attacking the power of incumbent legislators and state legislatures across the country. And no one gives up their power willingly, right? And so they try to fight back and take our power away. And I got to tell you, like if you are an elected official and you're trying to limit the power of the people, it always comes back to bite you. Like I think history bears that out pretty well.
Deanna Homer asks the question, can you give examples of referendums that have passed? Melanie, you probably know.
So I actually just tried to do a quick search on the Secretary of State's website and only found one of the 2. I think only 2 have ever passed. And one was in 1920 for a bill involving chiropractors. And I couldn't tell you what the other one is other than it was a long time ago.
Was medical marijuana actually a referendum when it finally passed? Is that is
It
not
was an initiative petition, a statutory initiative petition.
okay. Another question, Deborah Whitaker, what bills are currently still live in the legislature? Andy, you mentioned that only 2?
Yes, only 2, and I'm pulling them up. One is Senate Bill 947, which would require the ballot title to contain the notice of fiscal impact. And then I swear there's another one. It's the filing fee, the $1,000 filing fee, and I forget which number that 506, I think. I'm almost positive that's the other one. I'll have to, now I'm second guessing myself because I think I messed up my slide, so I'll check back and let you guys know.
Do we have any more questions? Feel free to type them in. Do you think this is going to be continuing? There'll be impacts on the initiative petition referendum process. I was really surprised to see that Oklahoma is one of few states that actually have that process.
So interestingly, this has been kind of a pattern in other states that have passed big initiative petitions lately. Several other states that passed Medicaid expansion by initiative, and a few that passed some criminal justice measures have seen the legislature try to come back and limit or make the process more difficult for initiative petitions later. We're definitely not the only ones here.
Interesting.
And I'll add that, yes, I expect because these are just dormant, so if they don't pop back up this session somehow, they will all roll over to next year. And especially the ones that are joint resolutions that would require a vote of the people, what I think a lot of people are watching for is to see the legislature could pass them, early mid session next spring, and then put them on the June primary ballot, and as a way to catch voters off guard, right? And so part of my effort in reading through these things and becoming familiar with them now and thinking through it is so that we're ready to roll to put the word out if that happens, to try to get folks informed and to vote against it. And in the past, when there have been other legislatively referred initiatives that sought to change the initiative petition process, those have not passed. So I think voters know, they see through it and they're like, wait, you're trying to limit my voice? No, we're not doing that. And so I have a lot of faith in Oklahoma voters to continue to see things that way.
Okay. I think we could move into the second part of the event tonight. Andy, do you want to go ahead and get your slides up for giving us an update on redistricting?
Andy, you're muted.
There we go. Thank you. I'm sorry. Thanks, Melanie. Too many things to click. Well, I will be quick-ish on this. I know everyone has been very patient. It is a few minutes after 7, so we'll try to wrap up as quickly as we can. I'm going to put on my other hat as Director of People Not Politicians now to give you a quick update on where things are at with redistricting as we near the time that they're drawing maps and the deadline for the public to submit maps. So this is not quite in chronological order, but I think this order makes more sense. Well, no, my thing will work. All right, so as most of you probably know, the US Census Bureau has delayed the release of the census data until September. Sometime before September 30th, they said that's when it'll be released. They will, I think by next month, release like the aggregate data so that every state knows how many congressional seats they get. That process is called apportionment. When they apportion out the 435 seats of Congress, it is expected that Oklahoma will retain our 5 seats. When we didn't grow enough to get a new one, we didn't lose enough to lose one. So we'll probably keep 5 seats. So that's kind of a moot point. And so they really can't draw those congressional districts until the fall. In the meantime, though, the state legislature is going ahead and drawing the state legislative districts this spring, and they'll be using data from the Census Bureau, the American Community Survey, the population estimates. I think it's 2014 to 2019. It's a 5-year kind of rolling estimate. That data has been already available. It is the most recent data the Census Bureau has. Some other states are looking at doing this as well. And this is arguably an okay way to do it, right? So they are taking the best data they have. They are going to draw the districts. And then in the fall, when the official 2020 census data comes out, they will come back in for a special session and adjust if they need to, right? So they've got like plus or minus 2.5%. So a 5% margin of error is kind of what their target is. And so if the population estimates aren't that far off from the final data, then in theory, they could come back and it could be done. It could be fine. Like they may not have to amend them at all. So we'll see how that goes. So that's just the state legislative, the state house, the state senate. For the congressional districts, because those have to be drawn without that margin of error, they have to be down to the person as best they can. And that's the standard across the country. And so they really can't draw those until the fall. I'm sure they'll preliminarily, if that's a word, draw some to work from to make it easier in the fall, but they will come back in the fall to officially draw those. Now, that means that the redistricting process is somewhat ongoing and a little up in the air for a lot longer than any of us bargained for. They are still submitting or still accepting public maps. So if you want to be involved in submitting a map, we are submitting a map, people not politicians. The deadline for those is Sunday, April 4th. That's Easter Sunday at 5 p.m. And there's a bunch of details about how to submit maps that are on their websites, and I will give you those links here in just a second. If you want to be involved, there's a bunch of ways, and you don't even have to draw the map yourself. And I know that because that's not for everybody. And so one thing you can do that would help us and help the legislature and a bunch of other groups that are using this same data is to draw your community using this tool called Representable. Some of you may have seen me talk about it before. If you go to this link, representable.org/drive/people not politicians, you can go on there and draw your community of interest. And that is maybe your local community where you live. Generally, they've got like city limits and those boundaries, but if you live in a school district, a cultural community, a historic community, of neighborhood association, or neighborhoods that all feed into the same schools or all shop at the same grocery store, or whatever the thing is that kind of, this is my community, you can submit that, right? And that's very valuable feedback that we need. So that's one way to do it. You can also attend our Fair Maps office hours, which we are hosting several times between now and the 4th. We have one this Wednesday. In fact, I think the next 2 Wednesdays from 6 to 7 p.m. It's on Zoom. We're doing it next Saturday morning and Sunday afternoon. It'll be me or one of my colleagues on there. You got to register in advance because we're not going to put the Zoom link just out there for the world. We've all seen how that ends up with Zoom bombing and whatnot. But if you pre-register, boom, you get the link and you can pop on, and we will give you some, we've got like some things to talk through, but we can also like walk you through drawing your community using Representable. We can help answer questions about mapping as well, because the legislature has partnered with Dave's Redistricting, which is one of the best and easiest to use like mapping, redistricting, mapping sites. It's free. It's honestly pretty cool. Even if you're not a huge map nerd like me, it's still a pretty useful tool. They've got some really great resources on their website where you can view our current maps. They've got other versions of our maps. Like it's a team of volunteers that drew all of the congressional districts in the country, including for Oklahoma, and all of our state Senate and state House districts. And they drew them 5 different ways, right? So prioritizing different things, prioritizing compactness, prioritizing partisan competitiveness, all of these things. So you can see, how decisions about what you value or devalue in the mapping process can result in dramatically different maps. So those are really helpful. And again, you can go on there, you can copy those maps over, and you can start bumping lines around on your own. You can see that redistricting is not an easy process, right? Like it's not just arbitrary. You really do have to kind of weigh things, but you learn so much more about your state, and I think the process overall. So all of these things kind of work together. If you're interested in that, you have questions, please join one of our office hours. We're happy to help. It will likely either be me or my colleague Katrina, and or our friend Dan, who is doing a set of maps himself. And he asked if he could come on. He's really eager to hear from people too, like we all are. We'd love to hear from you, even if you're not trying to do anything, right? You just want to come talk about redistricting. Come on, like we'd love to hear from you, and present that information so we can figure out how to incorporate it into the maps that we are drawing. That would be really great. We are also want to direct you to 2 other good resources. peoplenotpoliticians.org, that's our website. There's a bunch of information and resources on there. Just click resources, that's easy. The House and the Senate both have websites dedicated to redistricting. They both have a ton of information. Their websites are hideous, but if you go straight to them, even if you go to their homepage, okhouse.gov and oksenate.gov, they both now have links that say redistricting, which is more than they had back in January. So this is good. And they've got good information, as well as all of the details for how you can submit maps, what that process looks like. You can draw it on Dave's, you got to email them, and you got to email them the link and all this stuff. It sounds more complicated than it is. So there's all that. After the public submission of maps on April 4th, the legislature will then take those maps, review them, and invite people to come present that information. And so we hope that they'll invite us, and we'll go and present our maps to the legislature and go from there. All right. Any questions about redistricting? I'm happy to answer if there are. Ooh.
I think there are a couple of questions, Andy.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see one here from Beth. Does the legislature really not consider party affiliation when they draw districts? Great question, Beth. So the state legislature has said repeatedly that they are not using voter registration data or party identification data in their mapping this year. And so you can interpret that a couple of ways. One, face value, they're not doing it. Fair. Maybe that's the way it is. 2, They've said they have not requested that data from the mapping company, Maptitude. So they won't have that data in that system. Now that can be true. Like you can not receive that data, but you can still consider it, right? And the bigger issue, like this is, it's not like it's academic, but it's also like a valuable discussion, is whether or not you should use that data, right? I think they are saying we're not using this data and you shouldn't use it. And I would argue that maybe you should, right? Like the redistricting is political by its nature. It is the drawing of political boundaries. And if we just keep the districts the way they are, we very well might be clumping, like packing in, an excessive number of Democrats or Republicans into a given district, or we might be dividing communities in other ways. And so, and dividing them split between districts in a way that it unduly favors one party or the other, right? There are ways to gerrymander by doing both things, by packing and cracking. Those are two of the common verbs that you hear about that. And so I think, if nothing else, even if they don't request the data and they just they just draw the maps on their own, the guys drawing these maps know, right? Like a lot of folks, most people that are armchair politicians in Oklahoma have a rough inkling about the partisan slant of a given neighborhood or city or part of town, and so even if they don't have the data in there, they are also meeting with every member of the legislature to come in. They get to come in the office and say, okay, well, I want my district to look like this. Like I don't want that neighborhood, but I want to expand over here, or I want it small, whatever they can ask for. Well, the members who are elected definitely know their districts. They know the Republican parts of town and the Democratic parts of town. So even without the data, like they have that information at the ready. So I think it's being considered. It is probably not being considered as academically and as like honestly and usefully as it should be, in my opinion. Question from Deborah. Does Let's Fix This or People Not Politicians have a newsletter you can sign up for? Yes, both. They're separate organizations that do separate things. So sorry, there's an errand there. But if you go to letsfixthis.org or peoplenotpoliticians.org, you can sign up for either one. On Let's Fix This, you just scroll all the way to the bottom. So stay in the loop. You can sign up there. And then People Not Politicians, I think it's at the top, actually. So yes, please sign up. We'd love to keep you in the loop. All right, another question from Beth. After they draw the maps, can the public see the party affiliation percentages for each district? Ooh, this is interesting. So yes, and eventually yes. I think, so the legislature right now is collecting publicly submitted maps. They have not released their maps, though they are working on them, and they've certainly got something going. They've said that they will release them with enough time for the public to view them, kind of review it, check it out, make comments, give them some feedback so they can maybe tweak them before they vote on them. Now, whether or not that actually happens is a whole different ballgame. Eventually, those maps will be on Dave's redistricting, either because the legislature puts them on there in the process, like which would be the convenient way, because that's where everyone's maps will be to compare them. And so that information should be publicly available at some point. That's how Dave's redistricting got started, is that it's a bunch of volunteers who are passionate about this. And they started going in and, collecting the map files from each state and uploading them or drawing them as close as they could. And if you're on Dave's redistricting, as you move your mouse around it for each precinct or each census block, it shows you the partisan breakdown for that district, the racial breakdown for that district, the age distribution. So they've got all the census data in there as well, which is really fascinating. And so that's, as you draw it, you can see in real time how it affects all of those things. And so it's a very powerful tool. And the software that the legislature is using, Maptitude, is like even more, because it's a for-profit company, so it's not just volunteers running it. It is even more precise and a little more powerful in that way. But yeah, you can see it in real time as you do it. And so you can, if you add these 3 census blocks, like how does that affect the partisan lean or the racial distribution in a given district? Yeah, it's very cool.
It's very powerful.
It is.
Yes. So what do you think about this approach that they're having to use? I mean, I guess it's sort of a have to in drawing up the districts with a different kind of census data. Has that ever been done before?
Not to my knowledge. Everything
this,
about this is unprecedented, right? So
yeah.
I will say, mathematically speaking, population estimates tend to be more accurate than the actual census, right? Like there's a lot of discussion about this every time the census comes around, that it is extremely inefficient to count every single person in America, which is what we try to do. And we always miss people. It's just really, really hard to do it. And so using sampling data and running statistical analyses, you actually get a better picture of how many people are in there. But that depends on how good you did your census. And so what we'll be doing is going from population estimate data to the actual census data. And so there will be a change because we're actually going to like a less, in some ways, a less accurate, mathematically speaking, a less accurate calculation for the final maps.
Which is more accurate in terms of racial and ethnic numbers?
So obviously we haven't seen the 2020 census data to know for sure, but I will say in general terms, like just across the board, mathematically speaking, the process of sampling is more accurate in kind of all the ways. There's a really good episode of The West Wing about this where they argue about it for a long time. That if you're a big fan of The West Wing, I encourage you to go watch it. It's I think it's Mr. Willis from Ohio. Melanie can correct me on that, but it's a good episode.
Okay, did we have any more questions? I think we're good. I'm just going to remind everybody that we're recording tonight, and so the slides will be preserved and available as soon as Jackie posts the presentation, because I know we had a lot of websites and information from both talks. So there's one new. Okay, so no more questions. I think we are ready to sign off. I have to thank both you, Andy and Melanie, for giving us a lot of information. This was really, really interesting. Both in talking about the initiative petition. I knew nothing about it. So I just assumed every state had the same thing. I really did. So just that, slide 1 was really a revelation. And the kinds of changes that are being discussed was, it fires me up, gets the blood heated. So I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation and has a further look at the slides that Andy and Melanie had. Did you guys have any last words, or are we ready to sign off for the evening? I want to thank you both. It was really nice meeting you, Melanie, and good to see you again, Andy. And thanks again for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having us.
All right, we'll sign off for the evening. Thanks again.